Before power was measured in market share, it was measured in territory. Let's review the ultimate strategists. A realm can conquer land quickly, yet struggle for generations to persuade its peoples that they belong to the same political story. The historical puzzle is not just who prevailed, but how did rulers persuade many distinct peoples to see themselves as one community when they shared no prior common identity? At first glance, the answer can look personal, as if one stronger figure simply outmaneuvered weaker rivals and the rest of the system followed. The pressure is immediate. That explanation is too thin for the pressure we are studying, because political cohesion across a fragmented population may depend less on removing local differences than on constructing a shared narrative framework broad enough for. So the promise of this episode is a structural reading of power, legitimacy, and institutional durability, not another heroic summary of events. The pressure is immediate. The structure is exposed. How did rulers persuade many distinct peoples to see themselves as one community when they shared no prior common identity? That is the tension the institution has to absorb before uncertainty becomes political opportunity. The problem begins when distinct populations may cooperate under one ruler temporarily, while still lacking any common framework sturdy enough to make the whole realm feel like a shared community. Once that happens, leadership becomes a test of architecture, not charisma, because every layer below the center starts judging what still deserves obedience. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The relevant distinction is the difference between coercive unification of territory and constructed cohesion of identity across groups that still remember themselves as separate. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin. When that distinction is blurred, people often misread a structural weakness as a personal drama and then miss the mechanism actually driving the instability. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. That is why the stakes are broader than one ruler, one faction, or one disputed decision. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. The structure feels fragile. Everyone starts recalculating. If authority leans too heavily on presence alone, the institution eventually discovers how little of itself it can carry without constant personal intervention. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The lens here is constructed shared identity theory as a cohesion mechanism, and the point of that lens is to separate visible command from the quieter structures that make command durable. Constructed shared identity theory, how origin myths, ancestry narratives, and symbolic frameworks can create a political sense of common belonging across otherwise fragmented groups. The distinction matters here. The mechanism is becoming clearer. In conceptual terms, this mechanism matters because leadership can appear strongest precisely where the institution underneath it is least prepared to function alone. The distinction matters here. The mechanism is becoming clearer. The goal is not to pretend every historical setting is the same. It is to see where the same kind of institutional pressure keeps reappearing under different surfaces. Personal brilliance can dominate the scene, while institutional design determines whether the scene can be repeated after that brilliance weakens, disappears, or changes hands. The distinction matters here. That is why we are not asking whether leaders matter. We are asking what kind of structure their leadership leaves behind for everyone else to inhabit. The distinction matters here. Success in the short run can hide a delayed weakness if the system still depends on habits, permissions, or loyalties that only one person knows how to coordinate. The thesis then is deliberately simple to state and much harder to build in practice. Political cohesion across a fragmented population may depend less on removing local differences than on constructing a shared narrative framework. The first point is that territory and identity are not the same achievement, even when a ruler controls both with apparent confidence. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. A population can obey one center administratively while still understanding itself through many smaller lineages, tribes, languages, or inherited communities. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. That is why force alone rarely creates durable cohesion. Force can coordinate behavior without generating a story people are willing to inhabit together. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Constructed identity works by offering a narrative wide enough to include difference without demanding immediate sameness in every local practice. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Origin myths matter because they turn political coexistence into remembered kinship, even when that kinship is partly crafted for state purposes. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Shared symbolic language matters too, because ordinary people often recognize membership through repeated stories, rituals, and public signs before they feel it through law. That is the mechanism. The ruler's strategic challenge is to create a larger frame that local groups can enter without feeling that every prior identity has to vanish overnight. That is the mechanism. This is why successful identity construction often layers, not replaces, allowing people to remain local while also imagining themselves as part of something broader. That is the mechanism. The mechanism is not magical. It depends on repetition, public reinforcement, and enough practical benefit that the broader identity starts feeling socially useful. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. A constructed narrative also becomes stronger when elites, intermediaries, and common populations all have reasons to repeat it in ordinary life. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Yet that same narrative can remain fragile if it never sinks beneath ceremony into habit, memory, and shared expectation across generations. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. This explains why rulers return constantly to ancestry stories, sacred beginnings, common forebears, or symbolic genealogies that place many groups inside one imagined lineage. That is the mechanism. The point is not factual uniformity in the modern sense. The point is political recognizability across previously separate communities. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. A broad shared myth can therefore reduce the cost of coordination by giving people a larger collective vocabulary for obligation, sacrifice, and belonging. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. The strategic question is whether the narrative becomes thick enough to survive pressure, or whether fragmentation reappears the moment the coercive shell weakens. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. A fair counterpoint is that some realms appear cohesive less because the identity story is persuasive, and more because rival groups fear the cost of open fragmentation. The limits still matter. The limitation is that identity is difficult to isolate analytically from law, redistribution, marriage, religion, and local power arrangements that may reinforce the same outcome. The limits still matter. Constructed cohesion fails when the shared story remains too thin, too exclusive, or too disconnected from lived local experience to survive political stress. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. There is also an exception in highly plural frontier zones, where layered coexistence may matter more than any single unified identity narrative. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate here because a state can build broad cohesion narratives while still subordinating, excluding, or flattening real differences. The limits still matter. Even so, the pattern remains useful, where people gain a shared framework for belonging that does not demand total sameness. Broader political cohesion often becomes easier to sustain. Taken together, those boundaries do not erase the mechanism. They stop us from mistaking one useful explanation for a complete and universal theory of power. The limits still matter. So we can now return to the opening question with sharper terms, less mythology, and a clearer view of what the institution was actually carrying. That is the bounded answer. Rulers persuaded distinct peoples to imagine one community more successfully when they built shared narratives spacious enough to include local difference while still offering a larger story of origin, belonging, and mutual fate. In that sense, leadership is partly the craft of shaping conditions under which authority can move, persist, and still look usable after the central figure changes. That is the bounded answer. When that design fails, successors inherit titles, offices, or territories without inheriting the machinery that once made them governable. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality-based reading. When the design holds, conflict, rivalry, or uncertainty can remain because people still expect the institution to continue tomorrow. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality reading. The real measure, then, is not whether a ruler ever looked powerful. It is whether the system learned how to keep functioning when power had to travel through other hands. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate questions, yet both influence whether authority can endure without immediate collapse, improvisation, or deeper coercion. That is the bounded answer. the explanation still holds. That is the resolution. Durable leadership builds arrangements stronger than presence, while brittle leadership leaves everyone waiting for a person who is no longer enough. That is the bounded answer. Once that becomes visible, the topic stops looking like pageantry and starts looking like a disciplined question about structure, incentives, continuity, and institutional memory. That is the bounded answer. Study the architecture of command by asking whether a realm shares only administration or also a story of who belongs inside it. Ask the structural question. Authority moves through institutions, but identity moves through narrative repetition, symbolic recognition, and ordinary social habit as well. Ask the structural question. Look at the institution. Remove the ceremonial surface, and the deeper issue becomes whether people can imagine common membership without surrendering every local identity they still value. Ask the structural question. This outcome cannot be reduced to force or sentiment alone, because cohesion is strongest when narrative, institutions, and practical incentives begin reinforcing one another. Strategic effectiveness is not legitimacy, yet the lesson remains that broad political order often needs a wider story than cohesion alone can provide. Ask the structural question. The practical reframing is to ask which role, routine, office, coalition, expectation, or resource channel is carrying the system when personal certainty begins to fade. The safer historical question is not who seemed most impressive in the moment, but which structure kept functioning when pressure rose and authority had to travel farther. The unresolved dilemma remains whether a ruler can build a shared political identity broad enough to hold a fragmented realm together without pretending that genuine local differences no longer exist. Keep that question in view the next time a political story turns structure into personality and contingency into myth. The throne changes, the strategy remains. Until next time.